Good morning, and we are to the end of Nehemiah chapter 13. Nehemiah chapter 13. I've titled this, and I hope you look at the sheet if you've got this on the email, or if you're looking at the YouTube video, it's in the description. But I've titled this Ugh. 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 I mean, if we could have ended Nehemiah at the end of chapter 12, that would have been great. But we can't. There's a chapter 13. Ugh, because have you ever tried something but it failed? Or have you thought that you had the answer but you didn't? Or you planned the day but the weather didn't cooperate? Ugh. There's the saying, the cat is away, the mice will what? Play. Now the French version of this saying was, where there is no cat, the rat is king. Well, in chapter 12, it ends with choirs, it ends with instruments, it ends with worship, and even giving to keep the worship going. That's how it ends. And here's something else too. What's really unique about the Bible is that it gives us the failings of its heroes and the fallings of God's people. So it gives us the good, the bad, and the ugly. So we start this off by saying the cat left, Nehemiah. Nehemiah left. And if we go back to Nehemiah chapter 2, all the way back to Nehemiah chapter 2, and we look at verse 6, when Nehemiah goes before the king and he wants to go back and rebuild the wall, it says, the king with the queen seated beside him asked him, how long will your journey take, and when will you return? So I gave him a definite time, and it pleased the king to send me. So that was the game plan from the very beginning, that Nehemiah was going to be able to go, but he was going to come back to the king at a certain specific time. And so that's what has happened now in this whole account of Nehemiah. So let's look at Nehemiah chapter 13. And starting at verse 1 through 3, it says, at that time the book of Moses was read publicly to the people. The command was found written in it that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever enter the assembly of God, because they did not meet the Israelites with food and water. Instead, they hired Balaam against them to curse them. But our God turned the curse into a blessing. And when they had heard the law, they separated all those of mixed descent from Israel. Now, what he's recounting there is what we find in Deuteronomy chapter 23, 3 through 5. And here's the problem. The problem is on the trip to the promised land, when they were delivered out of Egypt by the hand of God from Pharaoh, and they made their way to the promised land, there was no help from the Ammonites and the Moabites. But rather they tried to get the Israelites cursed. And therefore, the commandment of God was to separate from them. That was the commandment. Now I'll say this again. It's a question about, not about race, but about religion. I'll say that a few times during here. It's not about race, but about religion. Because who's the most famous Moabite in the Bible? And that would be Ruth. Ruth is the most famous Moabite in the Bible, but there's a change that happens with Ruth, because when Ruth wants to go back, Naomi tells her to stay, and she says, no. She says, your God is my God. And so there's a conversion of some type that happens there, that she turns to the one true God. And of course, Ruth marries Boaz, and they have Obed, and Obed has Jesse, and Jesse has David, who is king. And from the line of King David comes the Messiah. And who is the Messiah? Jesus. So let's keep going here, verse 4 and 5. Now before this, Eliashib, the priest, had been put in charge of the storerooms of the house of our God. He was a relative to Tobiah, and had prepared a large room for him, where they had previously stored the grain offerings, the frankincense, the articles, and the tenths of grain, new wine, and oil prescribed for the Levites, singers, and gatekeepers, along with the contributions for the priests. Now, just kind of note here, the rooms for the tithes were empty. Were empty. So what's happening here? The people have stopped giving. They've stopped giving. And not only that, the priest at the time has rented out the rooms to Tobiah. Tobiah. Who's Tobiah? Tobiah is the fox guy. The fox guy. If we go back to Nehemiah chapter 4, in verse 3, says, Then Tobiah the Ammonite, who was beside him, said, Indeed, if a fox climbed up what they are building, he would break down their stone wall. So, not only is renting out to Tobiah, the fox guy, who's an Ammonite, okay, that's against what God's word has said in Deuteronomy, and he's a relative of his. That means he's married in. He's married in. So what's going to happen here? 6 through 9. While all this was happening, I was not in Jerusalem, because I had returned to King Artaxerxes of Babylon in the 32nd year of his reign. It was only later that I asked the king for a leave of absence so I could return to Jerusalem. Then I discovered the evil that Eliashib had done on behalf of Tobiah by providing him a room in the courts of God's house. I was greatly displeased and threw all of Tobiah's household possessions out of the room. I ordered that the rooms be purified, and I had the articles of the house of God restored there, along with the grain offerings and frankincense. So what's happening here? Nehemiah returns. He returns, and Nehemiah here acts a lot like Jesus, doesn't he? I mean, remember when Jesus goes into the temple? What's he do? He cleanses the temple. He says, you've made it into a den of robbers, but it's a place of prayer. And in a sense, he purifies it. So that's what Nehemiah does. He purifies the temple of Tobiah and everything that Tobiah had. And notice here that Nehemiah is swift with sin. He's swift with sin and not soft with sin. He doesn't go up to Tobiah and go, can we have a conversation? Let's just sit down and talk about this. Let's see what kind of compromise we can come up with. Maybe you didn't know, kind of thing. He didn't do any of that. He just, boom, just like that. When sin was there, he just attacked it. Now verse 10. Verse 10. It says, I also found out that because of the portions of the Levites had not been given, each of the Levites and the singers performing the service had gone back to his own field. Now, this goes back to last lesson. The giving had stopped. Therefore, the worship had stopped. See how closely tied those two are together? How tied together? And because there was no giving coming into the house, the ones that were leading the worship, they left the house and went back to the farm to work. So, okay, if you got your sheet, you're flipping it over. Verses 11 through 13. It goes on to say, Therefore I rebuked the officials, saying, Why has the house of God been neglected? I gathered the Levites and the singers together and stationed them in their posts. Then all Judah brought a tenth of the grain, new wine, and oil into the storehouses. I appointed as treasurers over the storehouses Shelemiah the priest, Zadok the scribe, and Pedaiah of the Levites, and Hannah son of Zakur, and son of Mathaniah, to assist them, because they were considered trustworthy. They were responsible for all the distributions to their colleagues. So what's Nehemiah doing here? He's putting everything back in order. It went out of order. He puts it back in order. One of the things he does is Nehemiah fires the leaders. He fires the leaders and assigns new ones. Sometimes that's what needs to happen. Sometimes even a church can get so out of whack that you have to fire the leaders and get new ones into place. And it's interesting because if we go back to Nehemiah chapter 10, there is they make this general commitment to God. Yes, we're going to follow you no matter what. And then they go into some specifics that they are going to do. But Nehemiah reminds them of their own words. In Nehemiah chapter 39, and the last part of the verse, part B of the verse, it says, the very last line says, we will not neglect the house of our God. That's what they said. Nehemiah is just reminding them of it, but they've done it. Now, verse 14, this is something that Nehemiah does all the time. Remember me for this, my God, and don't erase the deeds of my faithful love that I've done for the house of my God and its services. What does Nehemiah do here? He prays. And he prays kind of this way. I'm really not like this. I don't do this all the time. I'm used to building up walls. I'm not used to throwing people out. I'm not used to doing this kind of thing. And so he prays and he says, I'm not like that. This is so unnatural for me to do. And it is. I mean, nobody likes confrontation. Nobody likes to do that. Nobody likes to confront sin. But it doesn't mean that we aren't supposed to do it. Verse 15 and 16. At that time I saw people in Judah treading wine presses on the Sabbath. They were also bringing in stores of grain and loading them on donkeys, along with wine, grapes, and figs. All kinds of goods were being brought to Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. So I warned them against selling food on that day. The Tyrians living there were importing fish and all kinds of merchandise and selling them on the Sabbath to the people of Judah in Jerusalem. So what's happening here? They were working and buying on the Sabbath. Now, take you back. One of the specifics that they had made a commitment to God. Nehemiah chapter 10, verse 31. When the surrounding peoples bring merchandise or any kind of grain to sell on the Sabbath day, we will not buy from them on the Sabbath or a holy day. We will always leave the land uncultured in the seventh year and will cancel every debt. Oh, what a flip-flop. This is one of their specifics. Why is this so important? Well, the Sabbath set them apart. No one else was doing this. No one else was conducting their lives this way. So the Sabbath set them apart. The Sabbath pointed to Creator God because they were following His pattern. Worked for 6 days, rested on the seventh. The pattern gave credit to God for all provisions and the provisions that He would provide. The Sabbath was the most significant, important day of the week. It wasn't, thank God it's Friday. We would say, we really should say, thank God it's Sunday. Everything revolved around that day. And the Sabbath is blessed by God. In the Ten Commandments, it is said it is blessed by God. You want to be blessed by God? Keep the Sabbath. For us Christians today, it is the Lord's Day that we keep. And they weren't doing this. So what happens next? Verse 17 through 21. I rebuke the nobles of Judah and said to them, what is this evil you are doing, profaning the Sabbath day? Didn't your ancestors do the same, so that our God brought all this disaster on us and on this city? And now you are rekindling His anger against Israel by profaning the Sabbath. And when shadows began to fall on the gates of Jerusalem just before the Sabbath, I gave orders that the gates be closed and not opened until after the Sabbath. I posted some of my men at the gates so that no goods could enter during the Sabbath day. Once or twice, the merchants and those who sell all kinds of goods camped outside Jerusalem. But I warned them, why are you camping in front of the wall? If you do it again, I'll use force against you. After that, they did not come again on the Sabbath. Wow! What does Nehemiah do? Nehemiah takes action against sin. It's swift and not soft. He closes the door, he locks it so that no one can come on the Sabbath, and even the merchants are lined up outside the door. They're camped out. They're waiting for the doors to open. And he goes out there and says, hey, they're not opening. Yeah, you might as well just go on home. You're going to be waiting here all day long till the next day. It's not going to happen. So again, just look at how Nehemiah deals with sin. It's swift and not soft. Verse 22, natural reaction from Nehemiah is this. Then I instructed the Levites to purify themselves and guard the gates in order to keep the Sabbath day holy. And then he goes, remember me for this also, my God, and look on me with compassion in keeping with your abundant, faithful love. What does Nehemiah do? He prays again. He prays again. He's saying, this is not my normal action, God. This is not what I usually do. I want people to come into the city. But your word says to keep the Sabbath and keep it holy. And so he prays again. Verse 23 and 24. In those days I saw the Jews who had married women from Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. Half of their children spoke the language of Ashdod, or the language of one of the other peoples, but could not speak Hebrew. I rebuked them, cursed them, beat some of their men, and pulled out their hair. I forced them to take an oath before God and said, you must not give your daughters in marriage to the sons or take their daughters as wives for your sons or yourselves. It goes on in verse 26. Did not King Solomon of the Israelites sin in matters like this? There was not a king like him among many nations. He was loved by his God, and God made him king over all Israel. Yet foreign women drew him into sin. Why then should we hear about you doing all this terrible evil and acting unfaithfully against our God by marrying former women? Even one of your sons of Jodiah, son of Elishab, the high priest, had become the son-in-law of Sanballat the Horonite. So I drove him away from me. So let's stop right there. Nehemiah, what's happening here is another flip-flop. If we go back to Nehemiah chapter 10, this is another one of their specifics that they gave. And go to verse 30. It says, and we will not give our daughters in marriage to the surrounding people, and we will not take their daughters as wives for our sons. They're doing just the opposite. Again, let me say, this is not about race. This is about religion. For the people in that time, they worshipped a god called Moloch. And you know what Moloch, the way you worshipped Moloch, is you sacrificed your children. Now, doesn't that sound familiar? The result of these actions was this. The children didn't know the language of the Bible. The children didn't know the language of the Bible. Does that sound familiar? So what did Nehemiah do? He acted swiftly and not soft to sin. He pulled out their hair. Nehemiah gives a biblical example of Solomon. Yeah, he was a great guy. Yeah, God made him his king and everything. But he was drawn away by marrying foreign women. Foreign women drew him into sin. And then he points out that even their religious leaders were participating in this action. So verse 29, remember them, my God, for defiling the priesthood as well as the covenant of the priesthood of the Levites. Now, this is interesting. Nehemiah prays again, but it's almost like he steps away. Ooh! This is so bad that like he's waiting for the lightning bolt to come down and whoop, hit them. And on your sheet there, I put down, sometimes you need your hair pulled. Yeah, sometimes you do. And I put down Mrs. Pickens. I'll never forget Mrs. Pickens. Mrs. Pickens was my 5th grade teacher. And I was a pretty good student. I've always been someone who studies hard. I might not do things the proper ways, but I've studied hard. And so I don't know why, but we were having a history test. And for some reason, I thought I could not remember all those dates and times and things like that. And so what I did, I can't believe I did this, but what I did was I had my notebook, or my note folder, 3-ring binder alongside of me, and I had my test right here. And I was taking my test, and I came across something I didn't remember, and it was like, oh, I need a bit different pencil, and I opened it up to get a pencil out of my notebook. Well, guess what I had on the inside of my notebook? I had all the answers on the inside of my notebook. And I closed it, and I wrote the answer, and I got a little farther, and like, oh, I need an eraser. And I opened it up, looked at the answer, closed it. You never knew that your pastor was such a cheat. Well, Mrs. Pickens saw me. You know what Mrs. Pickens did? She was swift and not soft. And as when I had hair, she came right back there. She grabbed me right by the hair, pulled me out of my seat, and dragged me right into the hallway. And I tell you, I knew what was coming next. I knew I was not only going to the office, but there was going to be a call made to my parents. And I know in our world today and everything else and all that kind of stuff, but I'm sure glad I grew up in that day. Because I never cheated on another test the rest of my life. Because someone saw sin and they confronted it. They weren't soft with it. They were swift with it. I am so thankful for Mrs. Pickens. I know she's a Christian, and someday I'm going to see her in heaven. I hope I get the opportunity to say thank you for pulling my hair, getting my attention of what I was doing wrong. Verse 30 and 31. Let's finish it up. So I, Nehemiah, purified them from everything foreign and assigned specific duties to each of the priests and the Levites. I also arranged for the donations of wood at the appointed times and for the first fruits. Remember me, my God, with favor. So what's he do? Nehemiah just kind of resets everything. He resets everything, gets the worship back, gets the giving back coming in, and then he ends it with what? I mean, this is the most normal thing to end this book with, because this is a book about Nehemiah praying. And it ends with him saying, remember me, my God, with favor. Nehemiah prays. Here's the thing I want us to take away from this, is this thought. Do we comfort sin or do we confront sin? Which is it? What are we to do with lingering sin? Are we to comfort it? Or are we to confront it? And I would leave with this. This is the prescription of a church that's gotten off track. There's no ease and way back into it, kind of thing. No, a church that's gotten off track, I tell you, you got to confront sin and not be soft about it. And reset it, get it back on track, and then go forward. Always bathed in a lot of prayer. A lot of prayer. So I pray this has been a great study of Nehemiah. I love the book. I am so thankful because there's so many life applications that come out of this, but I hope this has been a blessing to you. Thank you for following along. God bless.